Good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to be able to see people in person. I think this is the first in-person lecture that I've been at the university since we've reopened this fall, and it really is an exciting opportunity for us. I'm Tina Chen. I am a distinguished professor in the history department and also the executive lead for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I come here moderating and emceeing for you this afternoon, having previously been the department head in the history department and having the great honor of working and talking with Tony T.K. Lau as he set up this lectureship as we began this journey for what we thought the inaugural lecture was going to be 2 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, I think. And there's been, as you all might have guessed, a few delays. But Tony's commitment to the university, and as we come here today, is such that he thought it was important that we gathered in person and that we had an opportunity to interact, to reconnect, and to build new relationships with each other. And so I'm grateful to welcome Tony back to Winnipeg, but also for this opportunity. So I would like to just begin today as we, this afternoon session with a land acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. For myself, I recognize the continuing connection of Indigenous peoples to the land, water, community, and the cultural authority of Indigenous peoples in these territories, both past and present, and into the future. I respect the treaties that were made with these territories and acknowledge the harms of the past, many of which continue today. For me here at the University of Manitoba, as I stand here greeting all of you, my commitment to truth and reconciliation includes recognizing the privilege of being present and accepted in academic spaces. And from this recognition of my own privilege, the importance of working with others to dismantle barriers and systemic inequities at the University of Manitoba and more broadly. And I share this because I think part of that way of dismantling barriers is building greater understanding, of learning about parts of the world and dynamics that perhaps we're not always entirely familiar with. So for me, I'm very pleased to be part of this event because I think it's part of that knowledge building that's essential in our community. I know you're not really here to hear me bring greetings, so I am actually now going to invite to the podium President Michael Benarosh to bring greetings.
Thank you, Tina, for emceeing today's event and for helping to organize it. And I won't take a lot of time, but I just want to tell you all how wonderful it is to have you here today. There's guests, there's alumni, there's faculty, there's students of our university here. And yesterday we launched our homecoming events here at the university. We launched it with our Indigenous homecoming event at noon, and then in the evening we had a homecoming event in this building with the Faculty of Music, which was wonderful because the faculty and the students broke out into 3 rooms, and over an hour and a half period, many of them performed for our community, and we had people come here from all over Winnipeg to watch those performances. And I was able to see, we were all able to see the amazing talent of not only our faculty, but of our students here. So this has been a wonderful launch. So there's kind of the events that take place today. I think it's wonderful to launch this speaker series during homecoming and the inaugural Tony Lau lectureship. And I say that because I only met Tony a minute ago. But I saw his enthusiasm for this university and how much he feels that this is such an important part of his life. Although I just spoke to one of his professors who said that during his history classes, they all saw the entrepreneurial spirit in him even when he was an undergraduate student here. And they knew he would, or a graduate student too, they knew he would be successful. And clearly you have been. But beyond that, in the creation of your company, the Tony Lau Insurance Agencies, you have been a recognized leader. So things that people should know about Tony is he was president of the International Students Organization when he was here on campus for more than 1,500 students from 70 countries. So Now we have 6,500 international students from over 100 countries. But it's on the strength of some of the work that you did with our international students that helped build the foundation to make University of Manitoba a place where students from across the world want to study, and we're grateful for that. And he's also the past president and founding member of the University of Manitoba Chinese Alumni Association based in British Columbia. And so we're grateful for everything you've given to our institution. And our gratitude then extends further to the opportunities you've created through exchange scholarships, for students studying in China, or even through the prize of Chinese history, which recognizes students and their achievements in the study of Chinese history. And now through this lectureship, which Dr. Chen told us was 3 years in waiting. And I think that was a good decision. Doing it in person is important. Seeing you here in person, seeing our speaker here today in person, it makes a difference. It builds community. It connects us interpersonally in a way that, I'm sorry, Zoom just doesn't. And it gives us an opportunity to really know each other better. And so I'm really happy that you insisted on that, and I'm thrilled to be here today, and really looking forward to a wonderful event. And my staff has told me that I have to do this also. I have to invite you all to the football game tomorrow, to cheer for the Bisons, the men's game in the afternoon, and then to the women's soccer game also at the stadium tomorrow night. So hope some of you can make it to that and help cheer on our Bisons, and enjoy the rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I would be remiss also if I didn't follow up, because I've been reminded many times, tickets are free, so you should go get your tickets. Everyone is invited to go. It's now my pleasure to invite up to the podium Dean Jeffrey Taylor from the Faculty of Arts, a longtime friend of Tony's, and he will also bring some remarks and greetings.
Well, thank you, Tina. Well, it's an honor to be here today to extend greetings to all of you on behalf of the Faculty of Arts at the inaugural Tony T.K. Lau Lecture on Contemporary China. In particular, I welcome Mr. Tony Lau to Treaty 1 territory, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Gregory Chin, our speaker today, to Treaty 1 territory as well. We deeply appreciate Mr. Lau's generosity in funding this lecture series. China has played a major role in the world for centuries, and understanding its significance and influence in the 21st century is of the utmost importance. We're also very grateful for the 2 student awards that Mr. Lau has funded, which the President mentioned in his remarks. In 2015, the Faculty of Arts had the opportunity to honor Mr. Lau as a celebrated alumnus for his support of students in the faculty. Well, I first met Tony in Vancouver in 2014, where we first discussed his interest in supporting our students. And I recall that Tony took me to a wonderful restaurant for our conversations, for which I'm eternally grateful. It was a wonderful evening. And during that visit, Tony also told me about his fond memories of his early years as an international student in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Manitoba, including living in University College, playing on the table tennis team, and working with a number of professors in the Department of History. Henry Heller, who's still on our teaching staff and is here today, was one who Tony recalled fondly. Tony also told me about his time working on the Lord Selkirk passenger cruise ship, which sailed the Red River and Lake Winnipeg in those days, and some of you of a certain age, like myself, will remember those days. It sailed the Red River and the Lake Winnipeg for dinner and other cruises. And Tony also remembers, and he has a wonderful photo of this, included a time he served Queen Elizabeth during one of her visits to Manitoba. So the photo is of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip with Ed Schreier, the premier of the day, and other dignitaries sitting at a dinner table, and Tony and I think 2 other members of the crew standing behind. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, with a particular thank you to our arts alumni who are in the room, and also and especially perhaps to those students who've taken advantage of this opportunity to enhance your studies. So I look forward, as I'm sure you all do, to an interesting lecture by Dr. Chin today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Taylor. Well, we've all, you've learned quite a bit about Tony and his relationship and the kind of impact of the university. I'm now going to hand over the podium to Tony so that he can introduce our speaker for today.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, I welcome you all to the first lecture on contemporary China. We hope that we'll repeat this lecture every year during homecoming. I was much humbled by the kind words from the President, Michael, and Jeff Taylor. And before I proceed, I want to recognize one very important person in my life, Professor Henry Herrera. Henry was my favorite professor at University College. So I learned much from Henry in University College, and I'm so glad. So Henry, in his very young age, can still continue teaching and continue to do research and take time to support us today. Thank you, Henry. So Henry was my favorite professor. I'm just saying this truthfully, my favorite professor. He was my advisor during my graduate studies. So the topic of today is China and U.S. economic warfare, more gain than pain. So our distinguished speaker this afternoon is Dr. Gregory Chin, Associate Professor and Undergraduate Program Director of the Department of Politics and in the Faculty of Graduate Studies at York University. He is a Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University, Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies. He has been appointed the Mei-Ling Burney Global Scholar by the London School of Economics and Political Science, and in residence at the London School of Economics in autumn 2022 at the Department of International Development. At the London School of Economics in autumn at the Department of International Development. Dr. Chin co-directs the Emerging Global Governance EGG project in collaboration with Global Policy Journal. He is a member of the advisory or editorial boards of the journals Review of International Political Economy, Global Governance, a Review of Multilateralism and International Organizations, and also the Journal of East Asian Studies. He has published widely on the political economy of China, Asia, the BRICS, international money and finance, global governance, and Canada-U.S.-China relations. From 2000 to 2006, Dr. Chen served in the Government of Canada in Ottawa at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade and the Canadian International Development Agency, and also at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Dr. Chen has been working on China and the Asian region for 4 decades, starting in the early 1990s. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Dr. Gregory Chen. All yours.
Thank you, Tony, for that very kind and warm introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking President Benarosh and Dean Taylor for being here. I'd like to thank Tina Chen and the team for everything they've done as far as bringing together this lecture. I'd like to thank the Alumni Association. I understand the Chinese Canadian Alumni Association here at University of Manitoba is very, very active and important. Thank the students for being here. And I thank Tony Lau. This is a really big honor to be here for the inaugural lecture of the Lau Lecture on Contemporary China. I think this is a really important time. If you allow me just for a second before I go into the details of my presentation, I think it's a really important time to launch this lecture series. Obviously, as Dean Taylor and President Benarosh already mentioned, China is really important in the world. It will only become more so in the future, however it goes for China. And so we all have to figure out kind of how to live with China. And China's going to figure out how to live with the world. But also, I think in Canada, at times the relationship between Canada and China has gotten a little rocky. And I think deeper understanding about the complexities of China is actually really important. And especially at a time where the debate about China in the world is hardening so much, right, in our country and in the United States, that I do think that it's actually really important timing to have this lecture. So thank you very much to the University of Manitoba for championing this and through the generous contribution of Tony Lau. So thank you to everyone. So today, I've put together a presentation that builds off of my research, some recent research that I've been working on. And looking at what I've given it the title, China and U.S. Economic Warfare, More Gain Than Pain. And what I need to be kind of careful in laying out the framing of this presentation and what I'm doing. I use the term economic warfare carefully. Some people say that term's too strong, right? That sometimes Asian governments or the Chinese government like that term. They see what the United States is doing as economic warfare. The term's too strong. And other people say, well, the United States never formally declared war on China. So, Greg, why are you using this term warfare, right? Economic warfare. And I think in one way or another, the term's chosen carefully and consciously, and not loosely. I think we can all agree that over the last half decade at least, if not longer, we do see growing tension between China and the United States. And especially, I would say, during the Trump presidency, you could see a movement towards what you might call economic coercion, or what in political science or political economy we talk about kind of coercive economic policy, foreign policy. And I think we are seeing that economic statecraft. And so I do choose the term, so though there's been no formal declaration of war, I think we can look at the details. And today I hope to really spend some time on some of the empirical data, because I think it's quite important, right? And to cut through some of the rhetoric, and then, we can discuss at the end whether the term economic warfare is too strong or not. Right? But I think it's worth considering, and I don't choose it lightly. I think so that precision on what are we talking about, empirical details, what's actually been happening. When I talk about U.S. economic warfare on China, what am I talking about? And I'll go into the details of that as far as policies. And then to also look at the impact, the consequences, the effects. And I think on the China story and Hong Kong, there's been a lot of negativity out there. And some of it is understandable. You know, like on Hong Kong, there's been a lot of negativity in the coverage, especially since the passing of the national security law and things like this, right? There seems to be this kind of dark cloud covering over, the discussion of Hong Kong, but also China, especially from the COVID scenario and other things. So I think it's important to actually look at these details, like what's actually happened, cause and effect over the last 5 years. And so today I'll try to draw that out, what intended versus unintended consequences, effects, net effects. In other words, there's a balance between intended and unintended consequences. And then thinking about impact and consequences from a short-term, medium-term, long-term standpoint. Right? And a lot of today I'll be talking about the short term, but then thinking about the medium to long-term consequences. The focus, I'll start with the broader kind of economic warfare, trade war. We've all heard about the US-China trade war. And then focus in on the spin-offs into commercial warfare, industrial competition, but then financial warfare. And I'll explain what I mean by that in the financial sector in particular. Right? And so this is where I'm really trying to think through the impacts, especially when we talk about the financial warfare between US and China. Hong Kong is a central part of that story, right? And what's happened in Hong Kong, especially from about 2019 onwards. But then also on the Trump administration, US Congress didn't just stop on Hong Kong. They've also introduced a series of measures that go after China, also financially. Right? And Chinese companies on the New York Stock Exchange, or trying to prevent U.S. investment in Chinese companies that are purported to be linked to the Chinese military, things like that. So this is where there's a lot that's been going on. And it's very interesting. The Biden administration, though I think many people hoped that the Biden administration might bring about a reset or some changes, maybe that's happened in other areas of foreign policy, but on the China story, it's fascinating, the continuity. In fact, even extension and expansion of some of the Trump era measures. There has been some walking back though recently. And I think some rational thinking is starting to prevail, to some degree in US circles, but we'll talk about that too. And then what are the key takeaways from the story that I'm going to try to present today? And some of the medium-term considerations and the policy considerations for the US, for Canada, for China. So let me just start. So here, this is where, and Tony, please, if someone can give me a sense of time if I'm going over, okay? Because I understand I had about something like half an hour, 20 minutes? Yeah, okay. But I'll try to be, yeah. Okay, I'll try to be precise. Yeah, thank you, Tony. So I think when we look at the Trump era economic coercion, it didn't just start with China. In fact, the Trump administration, they kind of declared trade war, if you want, on many countries, Canada, right? I mean, allies and rivals. The Trump administration was quite, and this is where people in political science, we've looked at for a long time in political economy, the tools of economic warfare, trade embargoes, sanctions, sometimes even when you attack the industry of the other country it's all about trying to affect the behavior of the other side, right? Get them to change policy in such a way that is towards your interests, right? And so this is where, and the idea here, I think, was that for a long time, as the world was trying to evolve, move beyond kind of violent fighting, although we now see in Ukraine and Russia, the return of this dynamic. In the case of U.S. and China, I think the U.S. was looking to use non-violent warfare means, to try to rebalance the terrain of struggle with China. So they were trying to use economic measures to do that. The Trump administration, though, was particularly avid practitioners of this type of tools, right? And I think that's where we can see it in Canada. We know through the NAFTA 2.0 negotiations. But in the case of China, you can see the Trump administration, as we all know, they started, the Trump administration launched basically the trade war with China in early 2018. And then 2019, 2020, you start seeing, they just an ongoing list of measures that they continued to introduce. They expanded the measures over 2018, 2019. And then 2019, 2020, you start to see shift into new tools that then went into the financial sector. And and the link between financial and commercial warfare, and focusing in on Hong Kong, and I'll go into that detail in a second. And then 2020, 21, you see then the financial measures from the U.S. onto mainland China. So from Hong Kong, then onto mainland China. So you see this kind of gradual evolution and expansion of the U.S. economic trade war, then into financial war. So that's one key trend, is that in some ways specific to the Trump era. But there's something else. There's a second trend that's important for our analysis today. And that is the U.S. actually, if you look, since especially 9/11, so 20 years ago, the U.S. arguably has been showing increasing reliance on financial warfare as a foreign policy tool. It's a longer-term trend. Juan Zarate, who was in the George W. Bush administration, Assistant Secretary of U.S. Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crime, and a federal prosecutor, in other words, insider. Juan Zarate wrote a book called Treasury's War. I encourage anyone, colleagues, to give it a look. It's fascinating, because Zarate was on the inside of the U.S. Treasury, and they built the tools to go after Taliban finance, Al-Qaeda finance. It started with the non-state counterterrorism. So how to track the money of these organizations. Those tools that the United States Treasury developed after 9/11 were then turned on to states, right? So you look at Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia, Turkey, eventually China. At first, not China directly, indirectly. China would get caught up in third-party sanctions, right? Iran, Huawei, right? Think about, but there were other cases as well. So, but what's interesting, so there's a longer-term trend that we're also talking about today, right? This is not something that just happened under Trump. Trump is a kind of escalation of this trend. And so it's fascinating. And I think there's a qualitative shift also that happens around 2019, though. If you're China, from China's standpoint, it goes from being an indirect target to a direct target of U.S. measures, financial measures. And that's part of what we're talking about today. You don't have to read all the text. There's a number of measures, and this your eyes will glaze over. But basically what happened is, I'll just sum up what this slide says. In 2019, China issues the national security law in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong begins to implement. And the U.S. begins to take measures. The U.S. Congress and the Trump administration begin to take measures to respond, to express their displeasure with the situation. But others say there was more going on than that. Significant part of the Trump administration was very uncomfortable with how integrated U.S. and China are economically. And so they wanted to push basically a decoupling strategy, how to, kind of create a scenario where the U.S. companies and banks start kind of pulling out of China. The global supply chains, the financial chains that hold it all together, try to encourage decoupling. And basically what happens is Hong Kong gets caught up. And, part of this is, so at first, it's the U.S. Congress issues the Hong Kong Human Rights Democracy Act, which President Trump signs into law in December 2019. July 2020, the U.S. Congress passes the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And these acts basically allow the U.S. authorities to begin to treat Hong Kong no longer with special status. Instead, treat it just like the mainland. From an economic standpoint, no more special tariff arrangements, right? But also beginning to ban the export of technology from the U.S. to China because of the potential that it has a link to the Chinese military, according to the American authorities, right? And this is seen as, quite from the U.S. standpoint, it was presented as U.S. national security interests. That somehow what was happening in Hong Kong with the national security law was threatening U.S. corporate interests in Hong Kong and U.S. national security interests, potentially. And so that's the kind of front legal face that was put onto these measures, and the rationale that was given by the Trump administration, U.S. Congress. And then in August of 2020, the U.S. goes further. They sanction Hong Kong officials and mainland officials that are linked to Hong Kong affairs. They sanction a number of the officials so that they cannot operate in U.S. dollars. They can't bank, in U.S. banks, and that, and also their families, and that they can't fly to the United States. Right, travel to the United States. And so these sanctions then were put on those individuals. And so what you see is the U.S. is basically taking a number of actions, which in a legalistic sense was to send a message, right, that the U.S. was displeased. And President Trump issued a statement, something along the lines, I have the exact wording, like, if Hong Kong and China, give Hong Kong back some more autonomy, in other words, undo the national security law, then we'll think about rolling back these measures. And so that was the kind of intended goal behind it all. The thing that the Americans did not do, and this is quite important, is they went so far with their measures, but what they did not do was they did not bar Hong Kong banks or U.S. banks in Hong Kong access to the dollar and the dollar payment system, right? Because there was some debate within the Trump administration whether they should deny the banks in Hong Kong and businesses in Hong Kong access to the U.S. dollar payment system. And if they had done that, the people call this the nuclear option, because this step would have basically, this is kind of what has been done with Russia now, right? With the Russian banks being denied access to dollars, U.S. banks, the SWIFT system, right? This was not, they didn't take that extra step in the case. So in Hong Kong, it was still targeting officials, individuals, and banks that helped those, but the banks became very careful, right? So those are the kind of measures that the U.S. did. But the Trump administration did another thing, is after losing the U.S. election, the Trump administration also made sure before they left the White House to introduce another series of measures, financial punitive measures, targeting China directly, like not Hong Kong, not indirect, like mainland. And the two most important ones were what's called Executive Order 13959, which was called Addressing the Threat from Securities Investments that Finance Communist Chinese Military Companies. This act prohibited, executive order prohibits U.S. persons from purchasing stocks, derivatives, bonds that are supposedly linked to Chinese communist military companies. Right? So this tries to ban U.S. investment in certain categories of Chinese stocks and bonds. The other thing that they did in December 2020, Trump signed into law another act, Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. And this threatens the delisting. So basically kicking Chinese companies off the New York Stock Exchange if those companies do not allow the American auditors to access their books, right, and to do thorough audit. Right? And there has been an exception built into this scenario, and the Americans have raised this issue over time. It never really was addressed by the two sides. Trump administration decided to, okay, they'll take it on. And so that was the other act that they did, and that was December 2020. The Biden administration, I won't go into great detail, but they basically expanded and extended all of these. So the sanctions on individuals started out with 12 individuals. Tony Blinken announced another 7. Right, so they added to the number of people that were on the sanctions list. But they also extended and expanded a number of the bans on especially technology exports to China, and they continued the ban on investment on companies, and they expanded the list of Chinese companies that were supposedly linked to the Chinese military. They did a number of other things as well that the Chinese side found annoying. The 4 U.S. agencies in July 2021, so the Treasury, Commerce, State, and there's one more, my apologies, they together issued a statement warning U.S. companies that they were facing potential threat or risk by being in Hong Kong. That their corporate executives, they claimed, were potentially subject to China's law, and that they could be arrested arbitrarily, or that they were basically operating in a business environment that was unsafe. This type of measure never was explicitly spelled out this way, but this is meant to damage the reputation of Hong Kong as a business hub. Right, and Hong Kong's ability to be seen as a good competitive environment, a good market environment, a well-governed competitive environment. And so, you could see that both from the legal standpoint and there's a political intention that is deeper behind it. And if you talk to legal experts, they explain how that can be understood. Interesting. So then impact. What's the impact of all this? One of the things that people who look at the trade flows say, well, since the U.S. started the trade war with China, in fact, the deficit, right, the trade imbalance has grown further. Now, part of that was COVID and PPE and, things like this, but it's not like the trade war has, kind of really helped the U.S. readjust the trade balance with China. It's actually gone the other way. And then as far as going after China on its so-called industrial policy and forced intellectual property transfers, what some people call state capitalist model in China, has this undone the Chinese state companies and that approach? No. Right? And so this is where you ask questions about how effective has this economic warfare been? Also, has it rolled back China's global rise, like the Belt and Road Initiative, or China's attempts to diversify across the global south? And I've listed some of the zones. So I think not really. However, it has had some effects as far as gradual decoupling. Right, like there is talk about U.S. companies coming back to North America or coming back to the U.S. Home shoring is the term they use now. Right, so there's talk about home shoring and working, and operating in like-minded countries. Right, so there is that talk, but it's hard to know for sure how much the previous global supply chains have fully been undone. Most people think that you're probably going to see 2 sets of supply chains for most companies internationally, one that includes China and one that does not include China, for foreign companies. Nonetheless, there are companies like Apple and others who are talking about, kind of reestablishing or establishing large facilities in the United States rather than in China. There is this talk that is happening. So from that standpoint, it's not easy to undo the Trump era, legislative measures or, policies. And Biden really hasn't really looked to do so far. So there has been some disruption of global supply chains, and part of that was COVID as well. So part of this is trying to untangle what is what. And there is talk about deglobalization, that it's, ironic that China seems to be one of the countries that is trying to maintain the integrated global economy, whereas, other powerful countries like the United States seem to be talking about undoing, right? That's so, so I think, but I think what we can say, and I'll try to move quickly here, is that the Trump era measures, they did achieve some of their intended effects in Hong Kong and in China. For example, the investment bans, the delisting pressures, they did cause some US asset managers to sell off some of their Chinese holdings in Hong Kong, in mainland, of the targeted companies, the targeted Chinese companies. So there was some. At the same time, though, this convergence of measures that the US brought together actually caused a lot of Chinese companies to begin preparing for delisting from the New York Stock Exchange and relisting in Hong Kong or Singapore. Secondary listing and primary listings, right? And some big companies already started to do this. And most recently, they talk about a big five from China, including PetroChina, like some of the big Chinese state companies were already said, yeah, we're going to delist, we're going to leave New York, we're going to go to Hong Kong. And there was talk that there could be a potential more than 200 other Chinese companies following if the U.S. sticks with this, the policy of try to, if you don't open the books, we're going to kick you out. So New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street started to have been talking to the White House, including the Biden administration, saying this could have serious repercussions for U.S. national economic interests, right? So the Biden administration is starting to rethink this now, right? And we have heard of talks between the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and the Chinese counterpart in China, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, talking about, okay, how do we do this? How do we set up a scenario where we cooperate, you're allowed to access, certain number of companies, and where China then will tell for national security reasons, because they don't want some of the companies to open the books fully. Okay, these are the companies that will not, so you don't list on the New York Stock Exchange anymore, right? These other ones, less vital to national security, okay, you can go ahead, we'll, open the book. So there is some, work being done now to try to find a way. And the talk is that that will happen in Hong Kong, actually. They'll do it in Hong Kong, not in Shanghai or Shenzhen, right? So that's quite interesting. Hong Kong has this very unique, interesting place, in all these things. And so, yeah, so I think that, you can say, okay, so there was some U.S. sell-off, but one of the things that's most interesting, and I've got some graphs and charts, and I won't bore you, I'll show them to you very briefly. If you're interested, I can talk about them, but where you can see, after the U.S. asset managers sold off some of their Chinese holdings, others rushed in. European, Asian, Chinese mainland. And they ended up buoying the value of those stocks. Right? And so it's quite fascinating. As the U.S. asset managers pulled out, others flowed in. Now, this is before 2020, right? So I'm really talking 2020, like 2019, 2020, 2021, first half of 2021. So you can see that, in fact, that's why my subtitle, More Gain Than Pain. Hong Kong actually recovered economically from a recession, because Hong Kong went into recession 2019, 2020. A lot of it was the street demonstrations, and Hong Kong dealt with a lot. They called it triple whammy, right? But one of the things that's so interesting is through this process and through these measures, one of the unintended consequences, if you could say from the standpoint of the U.S., was that Hong Kong actually recovered. It rebounded. The local economy and the Hong Kong financial, IFC, International Financial Center, financial market, actually continued to grow, right? I'll go through some of the data with you where I've looked at the detail of that to try to track the numbers, right? It didn't tank. Like the financial center wasn't damaged. It actually grew, right? And so this is kind of counterintuitive when you're thinking, because we all think of the U.S. as having so much power. But then you look at this, you go, wait a second, it's not quite, we have to look at the numbers here. And so it's quite fascinating. And so the other thing I would say is that in addition to money kind of surging into Hong Kong and into China's onshore financial markets, it's China's bond markets, its stock markets. The other thing is that the whole point of the Trump measures on Hong Kong was to punish China for taking away Hong Kong's autonomy, right? So one of the questions you would ask is, well, do you see a reversal of the national security law? Not at all, right? If anything, how did Beijing and Hong Kong respond to the U.S. measures? They pushed even faster the integration of Hong Kong into the mainland. Right? So in other words, it's the opposite of what was intended from the U.S. side. Right? So I think that this is also quite important as far as thinking about the effectiveness of the U.S. measures. And I've gone over some of these things already. So Hong Kong banks weren't punished. Large money flowed in. Yeah, and so I've already gone over some of those points. This is like, your eyes probably glaze over with this screen, so I won't read all this. One of the things I did was I talked to the people at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, so Hong Kong Central Bank. And I also looked at the IMF data, looking at 2019, 2020, 2021, and as much of 2022 as I could find, because it's still ongoing, obviously. And what do you see? After the U.S. applied those punitive measures, you don't see major capital flight from Hong Kong, right? Wealth and financial institutions did not leave Hong Kong, because there was talk initially with the U.S. measures. Would money flee to Singapore? Would banks go to Singapore or Tokyo or even Seoul? You don't really see that, nor did Hong Kong's capital markets recede. Rather, you see the opposite. Hong Kong financial markets recovered and returned to growth and you can see this along 5 key dimensions or measurements. If you look at indicators, total deposits in banks and financial institutions increased. And this chart here shows the increase over time. Okay? Exchange rate for the Hong Kong dollar did not experience major depreciation. So the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, right? And one of the things that people were expecting was maybe Hong Kong would not be able to maintain that peg, right? They couldn't afford it. If money was fleeing out of Hong Kong, that would put pressure on the Hong Kong Monetary Authority on its ability to maintain the peg in the value between the Hong Kong dollar and the US dollar. And instead, they had to intervene to reduce the pressure of money inflows into Hong Kong, right? So it's the opposite. They had to stop it from increasing too much in value, not decreasing in value, right? The Hong Kong dollar. The other thing is that if you look at capital and liquidity levels, well above global standards. In other words, and by global standards, they mean New York, London, Singapore. In fact, what you see, in other words, is that Hong Kong banks remain quite stable and the banking system remain quite stable. So liquidity level, the quality of the loans, their loan to asset ratios, how well the money is being managed, how much risk is out there, right? How much is owed to others versus, how well managed is all of that financially? And the IMF and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, capital and liquidity levels were actually quite strong. And this is a chart that shows you those 2 items. And it goes into the technical details of the quality of loans and profitability and things like this. If you want, I can go into that. But basic point is that similar to what you see in the banks and the other key global financial centers. Also, you see robust growth in Hong Kong's asset and wealth management. In other words, people were still putting their money in Hong Kong to grow their money, right? And so you don't see, money being taken out. Again, from 2019 to 2021, this chart shows robust growth on credit growth and asset quality, right? So this is where, and these are figures from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and I have quite strong faith in the reliability of the data of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority because, they can't play around with their data. Like if they want people to trust and have faith in Hong Kong as a financial center, they have to have a certain level of transparency, right? Otherwise, fund managers are not going to trust. So this is where, I think that the data is quite reliable. And then the last number 5 indicator is the exchanges, the stock markets, the bond markets, the capital, and here you see that the Hong Kong Exchange continued to grow. Initial public offers, so like selling of bonds and stocks, they continue to go up. And here are some of the numbers. Hong Kong was the number 1 IPO market for 7 years in a row. Hong Kong's main board ranked 2nd behind only the NASDAQ for IPOs and continue to grow at a very high rate, 27% per annum. And the financial secretary, Paul Chan of Hong Kong, said that the new listings, more than 1/4, that Hong Kong, new listings made up more than 1/4 of the total market capitalization of the Hong Kong Exchange. And daily turnover of the Hong Kong Exchange was over 80 billion per day. And this speaks to in Hong Kong, they've also established with Shanghai and Shenzhen what they call a Stock Connect and Bond Connect. So 2-way flows from Hong Kong into the mainland financial markets and then out, right? And so this has been actually really important as far as both from a kind of financial opening liberalization standpoint, but also to increase investment and to draw in capital and movement of capital. So those are some of the stats. This is too much. Basically, if you're interested, I can go into the detail of the Shanghai Stock Exchange as well. It's not, the capital markets, Shanghai, Shenzhen, they saw enormous growth, especially foreign money flowing into China's onshore bond market and stock markets. Right? And there was enormous growth in 2019, 2020, 2021. Right? Now, I will say, in second half of 2021 and in 2022, the growth levels dropped. It has decreased. But it's not because of the U.S. measures. It's because of COVID on the one hand and the lockdowns that have happened. But the other side of it, too, is that China, Beijing, launched you could call it crackdown or a regulatory clampdown on the Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, as well as the big tech companies, the digital payment companies, China's Amazons, as well as real estate and commercial developers, right? We know that there's some issues with the commercial real estate sector in China these days. There's concern about whether there's been a bubble and, bad assets and, right, debt levels. So there's some major cleanup that has to happen there. And e-gaming and even international service, like education service providers, right? So some of those assets, those companies were some of the highest performing assets in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and mainland stock exchanges. So kind of China was doing it to itself, right? And so it's an interesting question how far they want to keep going on this too, right? But and they seem to be sending the message that, they've cleaned up what they need to clean up. They're going to kind of ease up in the next while on those sectors. So there has been some slowdown, but it seems that it's largely internally driven by China. It's not about the U.S. financial warfare stuff. It's China doing it to itself. And so that's quite fascinating, so it's important to acknowledge that. So this is what all I'm saying is that it's not a linear story. These things, there's ebb and flow and there's multiple currents and trends that are involved. But just to say that at least from the period of 2019 to 2021, when the U.S. put those measures on Hong Kong and China, it didn't quite go as I would say people in Washington were expecting, right? And then in fact, China gained, and so did Hong Kong. They gained from, the unintended consequences of how things came together, right? Yeah, the takeaways, and I'm getting close to finishing here. I guess for me, what's important to take away from here is that the U.S., though they took all these measures, there were some limits to how far they went on this financial warfare with China and Hong Kong. They did not go to the nuclear option. There is concern in Beijing and in Hong Kong that as the Russia-Ukraine conflict intensifies, and as Russia has assets on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and capital markets, and China and Russia have ties, you never know if the United States is going to turn the sanctions or, these types of deny you access to this or that if they do put it on them. And so I've heard from, and it's been reported that people in the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and in the People's Bank of China have been drawing up plans for what happens if the U.S. tries to deny them access to the dollar payment system. I think for the U.S., they haven't done it so far because they know this is opening Pandora's box. If they do it, you force China and its trading partners off the U.S. dollar. Is China just going to stop trading overnight? No, they're going to find another way. And the potential of that is that you could fundamentally undermine the global role of the U.S. dollar, right? And so this is where it's literally Pandora's box. And I think that's why Trump didn't do it back in the day. They know it's one thing to try to do this with Russia, another thing to do it with China, right? Even with Russia, it's unclear how effective it's been, right? Because Russia seems to still be able to do certain types of business as long as people are willing to buy their oil and natural gas. So it's interesting. So part of this is geopolitical tensions continue to rise. China has been looking at diversifying and continuing to diversify and kind of reduce its reliance on the U.S. Economy and even on the U.S. dollar, trying to find ways around. And they're watching the Russia scenario very carefully. And so I think for China, it'll be really interesting to see in the next while what other measures they will take to reduce the geopolitical risk that they face. Hong Kong as well. People talk about the internationalization of the renminbi. This is the other big theme that I've been working on for about a decade now. Hope to have a book finished soon on this, the internationalization of China's currency, because I think this is the other element. Right? If you're going to reduce use of the U.S. dollar, what are you going to increase use of? Right? Euro, you can only use so much. Largely with the Europeans, what other currencies would you use? Right? And so this is where I think China's actually its hand is being forced to kind of increase the use of its own currency more internationally. They have no choice. They have to kind of do this. And it's a tricky one. If you want, we can talk about it because it involves political decisions about letting go of control, right, on the free flow of the Chinese currency. For the U.S., I think there's a really big question for them moving forward as far as dealing with China, which is how much further do they want to go with this financial economic warfare with China stuff? Right? There are people in Washington who say all the way, decouple. We got it, the chips and this and that, completely delink. It's the last chance, right? But I think there's also talk behind closed doors, including at the Pentagon, about how to think about U.S. national security and how realistic is it for the United States to try to maintain overwhelming superiority relative to the next peer competitor, right? And I think that's where the question is, the Cold War, when it ended, put the United States in a very unusual position, right? During the Cold War, the U.S. maintained military superiority as far as if you count missiles and that kind of thing and tanks, had some superiority relative to the Soviet Union. Collapsed the Soviet Union, the U.S. all of a sudden gained this kind of overwhelming superiority, unipolar moment. Remember we talked about that? No one else was even close, right, as kind of the Soviet Union disintegrated. And so the Americans became very comfortable with this idea, right, through the 1990s and 2000s of having overwhelming superiority. But I will say, I won't say too much, at the end of the Obama period, there were discussions in the Pentagon. How realistic, if China continues to grow at a certain rate, how realistic is it for U.S. to maintain overwhelming superiority? You might be able to have superiority, but overwhelming. Does it make sense? Can they afford it? Right? These are the tough questions for the United States, the inner looking at themselves questions, as they deal with this evolving world and how they sit relative in the world. And I would think that maybe the time, in my view, is, it's time for the U.S. to rethink some of this. For Canada, this is where I'll end. I think for Canada, we live in this world where we see the U.S., I think, become increasingly reliant on economic warfare. You can see it in the case of even the conflict with Mr. Putin in Russia, right? Sanctions and those things. And I understand why Canadian government or any government would want to do that rather than send soldiers in. I get it. They send the weapons to the Ukrainians to fight, and we don't send the soldiers, right? But, the question I think we want to ask ourselves is, what about diplomacy, right? At what point are we going to get to the negotiating table and try to talk? And I know there's debate about what's the right time for that. Do you fight first? Do you have to gain a position of advantage and then you talk? Both sides are going to try to do that if that's the case, right? The Russian side is also going to try to. So then where does this end? Right? I think these are the difficult questions for government, including Canadian government, is, what's the exit strategy here, right? We didn't think it through for Afghanistan. What have we learned, right? And so I think this is where, and as you see the United States, I think kind of go into this situation. I think for Canada, we have to ask ourselves, how far do we want to just be pulled along as the U.S. kind of does their thing, as they deal with their situation in the world, and to what degree do we need to think about this a little bit, not just kind of get dragged into things? And I really feel that it's important, especially in the case of dealing with the China, that things have hardened a lot. But does it really make sense for us to get into a scenario where we're trying to tell ourselves that we should be hating the Chinese? Right? Because this is kind of where it's going, I have to say. Right? We're already in that situation where we kind of, we're fighting the Russians, now there's basically say China threat, is this, and I understand, right? China is powerful, it's become bolder. But is this what, or do we need to figure out how to talk at some point, as difficult as it may be? And so I do believe for Canada, I would hope that we can at some point return to our kind of middle power bridge role in the world. This is kind of one interpretation of liberal internationalism, if you want, right? Others interpret as, we have to save the liberal world order and all that. Another is, well, at the end of the Cold War, Pierre Trudeau, Lester Pearson thought about, how to be a bridge in a world between extremes. You could argue that the world needs this as things become more tense, and things seem to be heading towards a world of two camps. So I think that this is where, for Canada, I think we need to think about that a little more, about whether, whether we need a type of courageous leadership, and where Canada can play in this kind of international role, probably working with others, and I would say even potentially others in Asia. Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. If you look at how they've positioned on this Russia-Ukraine issue, for example, right? They don't want war. They want, trade, investment. They want to develop. And they also, though, have an interesting positioning vis-a-vis Russia, right? They've criticized the war, but they don't necessarily want to join an alliance to go fight Russia. And I think this is where, for Canada, we tend to think of maybe the Nordic countries or the Europeans, and there may be, eventually if Germany goes through a really harsh winter and economic recession, and France, they may talk very seriously about getting everyone to the negotiating table too. That may be an opening for Canada as well. So I think this is where, for Canada, we need to think on those levels, maybe working with some in Asia who are thinking, and then, maybe some openings in Europe for diplomacy, rather than just trying to be the hawkish positions within the G7 kind of posturing, right? So I think this is where I understand the need to help in the case of the Ukraine, but I think we also need to think about the broader context here. And so, yeah, those are some of the ideas. Maybe I'll stop there for now. Okay, thank you.
Then I can take my mask off. Okay. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Greg, would you prefer to kind of stay at the podium and I'll moderate any questions from here? That way people can hear your answers.
Sure.
That's a little better than having to go back and forth.
Okay. Yeah.
Henry, how did I know you would be the first one with a question?
Thank you. I appreciate the detail that you gave us, and also the rationality of your presentation, your call for rationality. So important in the world that we're living in now, because as I see it, we basically, the United States is desperately trying to hold on to its world hegemony, and we see that the world is in a way slipping away, and China above all. And this attempt to sort of subdue China, which, if you have any sense of history, of real history, this is an absurd strategy, and it is not going to work, and it might precipitate some terrible conflict. So that's the one thing I wanted to say, but I want to I'm not going to go on. What I'd like to know is, Canada and Chinese relations have been damaged by all of this. And as we know, at the center of this was the Huawei affair. Mm-hmm. And also the whipping up of Canadian public opinion against China. Frankly, I have been disgusted by what has happened. So I'd like to know, in practical terms, to what extent has Canada, especially in its economic relations with China, been damaged by what has happened up to now, and because it is in the American camp, what is going to happen to Canada? China is the future. What is going to happen to Canada vis-a-vis China as a result of what's happened?
Right. That's a great question. Thank you for your comment, Professor. Yeah, I think think there's two ways to think about it, and I share a lot of your sentiments about how we responded in the last couple of years as far as Canada-China relations and the position that we got ourselves into. I think there's a couple of things to think through. One is that Canada-China economic, like the business people, I think because of the size of the Chinese market, and that they need our commodities. Now, we used to, even 20 years ago, export a lot more industrial product and value added, and it's gone now back much more to heavily commodity-based trade, which for Western Canada matters a lot. And so, we do see a shift in the composition of exports. The other thing is that, and we haven't been able to arrest that or, kind of get more value-added Canadian stuff in there, technology, innovation, in part because of, you could argue, we don't have a trade agreement with China. Part of it's also global competition. To what degree we actually have world-leading stuff. I mean, BlackBerry was right out there at one point in time, and then what happened, right? So but I think one of the things that we say is that even through the three M's, Madam Mung and the two Michaels, colloquially, Canada-China trade, as bad as the relationship got diplomatically, the trade actually continued to grow. It was modest growth, right? So it's almost as if the business people are doing their own thing regardless of kind of what's going on. At the same time, in order for Canada to benefit a lot more, and in ways that as the Chinese market continues to grow and evolve, for us to be able to capture those opportunities, we do need to be much more strategic. And that's where I think not having, for example, the opportunity to negotiate a trade agreement or investment elements within that means that we haven't been able to capture those opportunities in a proactive, strategic way. Right, so part of the negotiation of the trade agreement with China that was supposed to happen, that died, that would have created the platform to actually negotiate those additional things along the way, in addition to the terms and conditions of a trade agreement. And so it's an interesting question. At some point, despite public opinion, as you say, became very poisoned, like a trade agreement with China started sounding like forbidden fruit. Right? It was like, who wants that, kind of thing. The bad Chinese, right? They're holding our Canadians hostage was the kind of public opinion, right? So I think it'll take some time to eventually, if we have some vision coming, from Ottawa, and I think there needs to be a healthy Canadian debate across society about, how much do we want to depend on the U.S.? Is it worthwhile to think about other options in this world, to have some diversification options to Asia and elsewhere? And I think that those are the kind of debates that I hope we can come back to at some point. The challenge is that often in Canada, this is driven out of Ottawa, and it depends on who's running Ottawa as well. Provincial governments can also do some of this, I think. But I understand your question. It's some part of me wonders how long it will take for Canadians to come back to this eventually. It may take 3 years, 5 years if we're optimistic. But I do think eventually Canadians will come back to this, right? That we cannot just rely so heavily on the U.S., right? Obviously, the U.S. is the term, biggest friend and ally, long term. But at the same time, there's been thought about the need to diversify for a long time in Canada too. Yeah, thank you.
I know that there's also a reception outside, so I'm wondering if there's two questions I know in the audience. I'm wondering if you're okay if we take them both at the same time.
Sure. I'll try
and
to.
that way you can respond.
Yeah, I'll try to be quicker. Sorry.
From there. Oh, no, that's fine. I just know that, I thought that might be just keep us moving through, and that way we can get to the reception as well and continue conversation. So go ahead, Radhika, and Both off, put your questions forward, and then Greg can answer them together.
Thanks for a great talk, Gregory.
Thank you, Professor Desai.
I guess the most intriguing thing you said for me was when you said that you feel that in the Pentagon, in other high circles of policy in the United States, there is some talk about, we need to have a different strategy. We can't want to be overwhelmingly powerful, overwhelmingly superior to everyone. So I guess I have three interrelated points I would like you to respond to. So at one level, I find that this is completely implausible. I mean, look at what's going on. I mean, they are declaring so-called genocide in Xinjiang. Nancy Pelosi goes to Taiwan. Everything is being done to ratchet up. President Biden declares this chip strategy or whatever he's going to do, God knows. Anyway, and everything is being done to ratchet up tension. So where is this rethinking going on? But on the other hand, I agree with you about two other things. Number one, I don't think that in recent decades you have ever seen the kind of public disagreement that you've seen among high-level scholars and policymakers that you now see, for example, John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs coming out so completely opposite to the main line, even though, as far as the two political parties are concerned, they both agree actually that China is the threat. Where they disagree is what to do about Russia. But that's a different matter. So they all agree that China is a threat, but these guys are coming out. And anyway, and actually, I should also add that as far as I can tell, people like Mearsheimer or Sachs or Andrew Bacevich at the Quincy Institute, they still think China is a threat. So in that sense, then where is this new thinking going to come from? And then finally, I entirely see, I've been looking wherever I can for signs that American business people will say, come on, stop this nonsense, we've got to trade with China, etc. And I'm sure they are. And from what you say, the American deficit has gone up. It surely is because they're trading with China hand over fist. But nobody is saying anything. So how do you make sense of all this?
That's a great, those are great points, Professor Desai. I think there's a couple of things. Part of it is how we read Joe Biden, right? And I think part of this is try to distinguish what Biden may be thinking from others in his administration who are probably harder on China. I think Biden is being pushed by the Congress on the Taiwan issue, and so he's, and he's thinking about getting, winning the next congressional election kind of thing. So I think that's part of what we're seeing there. I think the other thing is Quincy Institute in Washington, which you identified, is actually probably Michael Swain, people like that are quite important as far as putting out that view about restraint, right? Is there a need for the U.S. to be a little more restrained? They may say China's a threat, but it's how do you respond, right? Or potential threat. How do you respond? Do you respond like guns a-blazing, Taiwan, or do you try to be somewhat more restrained? And to me, that debate still matters. I hope the U.S. still has that debate within them. Yeah. And so I think that's probably something. I think as well, there was a time where people at Harvard, some people were having those debates as well around Ash Carter, who was former Secretary of Defense. Right, this during the Obama period. And so there was talk. So part of this is the political leadership. I think this is total speculation, if the Republicans win the next presidential election, and if it's someone who's like, whether it's Trump 2.0 or some very hawkish Republican, then I don't think that internal debate is it's gonna be, more of what we've seen. Right, so it'll be really interesting to see. I think it's probably more on the Democrat side that we would see this type of internal debate potentially. But as you say, the Taiwan issue becomes the one that clouds a lot of this. And so, how far does the U.S. Congress want to go in enabling Taiwan's push for autonomy? Right, that's a really interesting question there. And so there are discussions in U.S. Naval College, including with Brown University, I took part in something, those kind of discussions where there is discussion about economic warfare on China and, the Taiwan question. And this is the one that kind of wakes everyone up and says, is the United States really willing to go to war over Taiwan? This is a really interesting question. And if you're not, then what do you do? Right? Because right now they're unclear about this. So it may get linked in together that way, Professor Desai. So, these are maybe some things to track for potential break, a little bit of a break from, yeah.
I think we'll just take one last question. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. And I'm just curious to bring Canada back into this a little bit. So you recently contributed to the Canada Among Nations collection, and you basically argued that the stage was kind of set for the stalling or the souring of relations between Canada and China even before Meng Wanzhou, with Canada's prioritization of first CETA, the European Trade Agreement, and then the renegotiation of NAFTA. So you make the argument that there were cleavages and divisions within Trudeau's cabinet that kind of gave way to a kind of incoherence around China policy. And you argue that ultimately the US lobby won out. And I'm curious, who is the US lobby in your mind? What are the sort of social forces behind that? In particular, because you argue that, you point out that large, medium, and small business lobbies across the country were almost in unison, that they want this trade deal with China. So I guess, who is the US lobby, and how are they able to kind of outmaneuver the most powerful social forces in Canada?
Thank you for reading the piece. I'm surprised it was only published a couple of weeks ago. Thank you. It's a risky piece. I may have, made some people unhappy in Ottawa, so thank you for reading it. Because I criticized basically their handling of the trade agreement discussions with China, which never got off the ground, right? That stalled in 2018, 2019. So to answer your question, I think there's a couple of ways to think, because I didn't go into great detail on that U.S. lobby, the Canadian-U.S. lobby. So one of them would be there's the U.S.-Canada Business Council, right, which is very active in Washington, D.C. But the other thing that Canada did under Chrystia Freeland was they actually arguably borrowed something that Canada used before with China, when you talk about Team Canada, right, of all the key ministers, the prime minister, the provincial premiers, the heads of the companies. They basically created that type of network for the NAFTA 2.0 negotiations to try to lobby U.S., state to state, Congress, Washington, right? It was like the full all-angle lobbying that Canada did to try to get support for a new NAFTA agreement, because Trump was making a lot of threatening noises, right, about, either terrible terms or no agreement. And so that made a lot of the Canadian business interests worried. Yeah, so I would say that those business interests are very powerful. They're probably more powerful than whatever Canadian-China lobby, right? So the Canadian-China lobby, it has influence, right? It has links to Bay Street and things like this in Toronto and Montreal, power bases there, but probably not as influential and comprehensive as the Canada-U.S. lobby, right? For obvious reasons, because so we have such a huge amount of our exports go to the U.S. So, I think that was a very interesting, as you say, scenario. In a nutshell, thank you for reading it. My basic point there is Justin Trudeau had a very short window to make it happen with China. And he needed to be really focused and strategic. And he made the fateful decision of handing it off to a trade minister who really wanted to focus on Europe and not on China and India. And when he did that, that combined with some of the consular issues that were unresolved between Canada and China, right, because they were holding some Canadians, like the two Michaels is not the first story, right? There was the Garrett story earlier before, right? China was holding two Canadians. And so that had to get resolved because within the Trudeau cabinet, they couldn't get They didn't feel it was politically right domestically in Canada to go ahead and negotiate a trade agreement with China if the Chinese are still holding two Canadians, So I think that's, but Trudeau really needed to hit the ground running. He had about a 2-year window before Trump came in and really got his act together. And you could see whether it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, they both took very hawkish positions on China for the 2016 presidential campaign, if you remember. Right? So you knew that things were going to get tough from the U.S. And so Trudeau had a very short window, and I don't think they handled it well. So thank you for asking. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking Greg for a very thought-provoking talk. As I already said, we do have a reception following, but prior to inviting you to join us outside, I would like to invite Tony back up to the podium for a gift of thanks to Greg.
Before my presentation, I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the good work Dr. Tina Chan has done in organizing this lecture. Ahead of you. And thank you for acting as a capable MC and moderator. So, some months ago, I started to deal with a challenge back in Vancouver to invite the appropriate speaker for our inaugural lecture, to set tone for future lectures. So the challenge is, I like to find a scholar with balanced view, no China lover, no China hater, somebody with a balanced view, very important. Second, solid research on China. Those are essential ingredients. So I started searching, looking for the right person. Then in my research, then I found, hey, this man acted as a diplomat. He also lived in Beijing for quite a few years. Then there is this handsome face. So we're not talking about just a beautiful face, somebody with some solid background, not just a beautiful face. So I started connecting with Dr. Gregory Chen by email, and then we talk. Then I tried to convince him, hey, come. The weather's nice. We have nice people. Dr. Tina Chan, the president, and the dean, Jeff Taylor. So finally he said yes. Then I was so happy. And this is quite true. On record, I sent email to Tina. I said, Tina, we lucked out. I remember, that's still in the email. The two words, we lucked out, we got him. So here, you didn't disappoint us with this balanced view, factually oriented. So I'm so happy, Greg, we can't afford a big fortune to pay you. So please accept this very modest gift in recognition of your service.
Thank you.
The talk.
Thank you very much.
So can we have a photo?
Thank you, Tony. Greg, you can stay there for just a moment. I'm going to invite now up to the podium Dr. Rasheen Kassar, the head of the history department, who also will give some thanks.
Hi, everybody. So on behalf of the History Department, I'd like to present this gift to Professor Chin with thanks for a very stimulating and thought-provoking, and I have to say, very clear and comprehensible lecture this afternoon. And I think that those of us who work very much outside this field, and I'm sure that also I can speak for the students here in saying that you've left us with ideas that I think many of us can take away and be thinking about for time to come. So thank you. Thank you very much. And let me also just take 2 seconds to also say thank you on behalf of the History Department to Tony Lau, whose generous donation, and we've heard today about the generosity of his donations over the last number of years, to the Faculty of Arts and to the History Department have provided crucial support in both the form of this lecture, and as we're seeing, this is the first one of what we hope will be many more, and in awards designed to promote student interest in China and the history of China. So from us in the History Department, again, thank you so much, Tony. Oh, last thing is to say, as Tina has been saying, please come to the reception, which is just outside here in the lobby. You're all invited, and we'd love to have a chance to talk a little bit more. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karsar. And with that, I will close the lecture, and hopefully we will be planning for the next one in the coming year. But please do join us outside for the reception. And I'm sure that both Tony, Greg, and others would be happy to chat more and share ideas with all of you. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Happy homecoming, and come to the football and the soccer games, right? I know we're supposed to say that. Thank you, everyone.